We're here on Daf Zayin Amid Beis. Omer Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chaniloi. Well, I'm sorry. Omer Rabbi Tanchum Braid Rabbi Chia Ish Kfar Akko. And this is a continuation of our discussion about Atziras Kishamim. If the rains are not coming down. Ein hageshamim ne'etzarim ela im kein ischayvu sonem shel Yisrael. So this is a lashon saginor, euphemism, ploya. In other words, that we should be condemned. He says lahashmada in Hebrew, for destruction. Shenemar pasuk in Eov. Sia gam chom yigzelu meme sheleg shaol chato. He says, Kishe Yimei hayovesh v'achom, there's going to be a dry season, yismashchu, and they will continue, I guess they'll be extended, Yigzelu esmei hagshamim. They will steal the snow. What does that mean? Klomar shelo yerdu gishamim ushlogim. That neither rain nor snow will fall. Mishum sheYisrael she'ol chato. They've reached the bottom of the barrel, which he calls here Chatu chatoim chebeginam aleim laredis ligehenam. Wow, they've sinned to the extent that the violations deserve that Klal Yisrael Chasham should go to Gehenna. And he writes here, in the name of the Riaf, in the Ein Yaakov, he says that what Rabbi Tanchum Braid Rabbi Chia is telling us is that even though there will be sins of Israel that will not be forgiven and atoned, Kol Zman Shelo Yeh Lehem Avonos Shebeshvil Yu Ra'ayim Ru'uyim L'Kloya Lo Ya'atzu Geshamim. In other words, it's only when we sin in the greatest way and we cross all the red lines and we deserve Chas Shalom destruction, only then will we be suffering from the lack of Geshem. And this is against the previous statement here in the Gemara of Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chaniloi, because he said that the Geshamim Yordim Rak Asher Nimchalu Avonoseim Shel Yisrael, that in order for the rains to fall down, come down from the heavens, we need a mechila, in a positive sense, an atonement and a forgiveness for our sins. But now we're saying that even if we don't have atonement, as long as we haven't violated those severe sins that would make us worthy of destruction, then the rains will not be prevented from coming down. Amalei Ze'iri Midi Havis, from a place called the Havis L'Ravina. Mehacha Masnisu Le. You derive that the rains will be withheld because the Jewish people have crossed all bounds and we deserve destruction. From that pasuk, Anan Mehacha Masninin Le. We derive from a different pasuk in Perek Yud Aleph of Sefer Dvarim. It says, "V'yatzaras hashamayim lo yeh matar v'adamolos tenis yulav v'adatem meira." When does HaKadosh Baruch Hu prevent the rains from coming down? That's Ksha'am Yisrael Schayvu Le'eh Oved Min Ha'olam Avadetem. So he's emphasizing the word Avadetem. Amar Rav Chizda, Ein Geshamim Netzarim Ela B'Shvil Bitul Trumos Umaisros. So we have Maisros, which means Maiser Rishon and Maiser Sheni, and Trumos means Truma and Trumas Maser, meaning Truma is what the Israel has to separate for the Kohen, and Trumas Maser is what the Levi has to separate from his Maser. Shenemar, from whence do we derive this? And we have now a drush from a pasuk in Eov. It says in Eov, Sia gam chom yigzelu meimei sheleg, which is a pasuk that we saw earlier, that the dry season will, so to speak, steal the snowy season. My mashma, what do you see in this pasuk that allows you to derive the conclusion that the reason why the rains don't come down is because the sin of bittul trumas and maisros? Ona the Rabbi Shmuel, we learn in the brisa of Rabbi Shmuel, Sia, right? That was the opening word here in this pasuk that we quoted. Sia, he's darshaning as a lashon tzivui. B'shvil dvarim shetzivisi eschem, that which I commanded you, b'yemos hachama, during the summer months. And that means lahafris chumos umasros. And the Maharsha adds that in contrast to leket chikupeya, which applied during the time of the katzir, meaning after the harvest, trumas umaisros is a mitzvah hanoheges gambi mosachama, gambi mosachshamim, both during the rainy season and during the dry summer season as well. And since the pasuk says gam chom, and also heat or warmth, therefore Rabbi Shmuel interprets it as the mitzvah of hafrashas trumas and maisros, which is a mitzvah that applies both during the rainy season and during the hot season. So that's the diuk from the word gam chom. Is yigzalu mikem meimei sheleg b'mos hagshamim, the rains from the winter season will be taken away from you, stolen from you. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, ein hagshamim netzarim el b'shvil mesapre lashon hara. The sin that brings about the withholding of rain is lashon hara. Shenemar, a pasuk in Mishle. Ruach Tzafon, a northerly wind, a cholel, Geshem, I guess the word techolel, which we translate it usually as desecration, but here it's interpreted as bitul, as withholding. You read as hagshamim, and means the clouds in the sky will be spread throughout the sky. He writes here in the note, based on the Gemara Yevamis Ayin Beisha B'Shosh and Osheves Ruach Tzfonis, when there's a northerly wind, Zorachas Achama, the sun rises, and he writes that Kodesh Baruch Hu Yira or Yara, Panim Nizamim. I guess an angry countenance, the Atziras Gitshamim, by withholding the rains. Zeu Mishum Lashon Hara. And where do we see an indication of Lashon Hara? Because it says Lashon Saser. Saser means that which we say in a quiet voice, in secret. And we see this in Dvarim Chav Zayin. The Torah says, Or Makeh Re'eu Baseser. Cursed is he who hits his friend in a concealed way. And Rashi interprets that pasuk as Lashon Hara, Medaber Lashon Hara. Also in Tehillim, Kuf Aleph, it says, Mal Shenei B'Seiser. And that's a reference to Lashon Hara. So Lashon Hara is said in a sort of secretive way. Omar Rav Sala, Omar Rav Hamnunai Negesham Netzar Mel B'Shvil Azei Panim, for the chutzpahdik, those who are bold and brazen in a negative way. Shenemar, and this might just be a reference to immorality. It says in Yirmiyahu, Vayimanu Revivim Umalko Shlohoya. The showers have been withheld. There is no rain. Malkosh is the rain that comes later on in the season. And why? Because Umetzach Isha Zona Hoyalach. And then it says, Me'ant Ikoleim. So the Navi says to Klal Yisrael, who are being compared to a woman, that the reason why the rains are being withheld is because of this brazen azus panim that you had. Shebishvila miana mianto lisbayish uli kolem al masecha. As a result of this bold and brazen attitude, you refuse to be ashamed. The Omar Rav Sala, Omar Rav Hamnuna, Kol Adam Sheish Lazis Ponim Sof Nichshal Ba'avera. It's not coincidental that the pasuk talks about an Isha Zona. And because of Azus Ponim, a person comes to have a taiva for Noshim, and this expresses itself in a visit to a zona. Shenemar Metzach Isha Zona Hoyalach. Klomar, what does this mean? Mishum Shahaisu B'cha Azus Ponim, Umianto Livosh Al Masecha. You refuse to be embarrassed about your actions. Tikoshel Biznus. Someone who's not embarrassed, he'll do anything. V'yelecha metzach kishel isha zona. I'm not exactly sure why there's an emphasis on the forehead. Let me just see if he adds anything. 1 second. And you had the forehead of a harlot. Okay, I'm not sure what that means. Omar Rabba Bar Rav Huna Kol Adam Cheish Lazis Ponim Nachman Amar Biadua Shenichshal Ba'avera Shenemar Hoyalach Below Nemar Yelach. You already had this relationship with the Zona in the past, and that's why it uses the past tense of Hoyalach. I'm looking for examples of azus ponim that he has in mind here. Hasibo shemuto likroso rasha ena bishel azus ponim greda elamishum shebevadei nichshal kfar ba'avera. Azus Ponim is not rishus per se, but it's indicative of an Avera that he violated. Maybe he did tshuva, but as a result of his Azus Ponim, that proves to us that he still remains in that state of merit, of rebellion. Shenemar, the pasuk says in Mishlei, ha'e'ez ish rasha b'fanav. Klomar, he says, imhu adam sheyesh lo azus krolo rasha b'fanav. You can call him a rasha. You know that he is wicked. Rav Nachbar Yitzchak Omar, adam sheyesh lo azus panim mutal l'snosa. You're allowed to despise him. I don't know what the chiddush here is. If you're calling him a rasha, he writes here in the note that despite the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael, v'aftalech kamocha, here, Shenemar v'yoz pana Yeshuna, he says, when it says here mutter, that you're allowed to hate him, l'chora ein ze el rishus, it doesn't really mean that you have to hate him, you're allowed to hate him. But Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak himself seems to be of the opinion of Masechet Pesachim, sheish mitzvah lisno es ha'over avera. And therefore the question is, why does Rav Nachman here in our sugya use the word mutter? He says, "Hitochen shebesugyasenu ein kavanas Rav Nachman likones lenidon shel hagmar b'pesachim im yesh mitzvah lisnoso kevan she'over avera o she'ein ze el rishus elachadish afilu avon shel azus panim is matir lisnosa, and it's no longer included under lotisnas achicha bilvavecha." But enochinami, if you open up the Gemara in Pesachim, you see that you go a step further, that it's even a mitzvah to hate him. Now, the pasuk in Koheles that he brings says the boldness of his face will be transformed. Yeshuna, transformed. Miloshin shinu. But he says, Al tikre Yeshuna, don't read it as Yeshuna with a shin, but rather Yisna or Yisnei with a sin. And that's a lashon of sinah. And the pasuk is telling us that an az panim is sanui, which means that you're allowed to hate him. Omar of Kintina, ein agishom netzarim el b'shvil bittul Torah. The sin of bittul Torah is the source and the cause of the rains being withheld. Shenemar, pasuk in Koheles, ba'al tzaltayim yimach hamekara, which literally translates as through laziness, the roof collapses. But we're going to darshan on that. Batzaltanim, b'shvil atzlus, she'hoya b'Yisrael shelo osku b'Torah, because of their laziness, that they didn't dedicate their time and their efforts to the study, to occupy themselves to study Torah, yimach. And what does yimach mean? Yimach literally means to destroy. You just see how he translates the word yimach. Collapse, to collapse. Nase sono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, klomar HaKadosh Baruch Hu atzmo mechuna mikara. Wow, this is amazing. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is being kaviyochol compared to mikara, meaning a poor person. Kaviyachal mach. God himself becomes like weak, so to speak. He can't, again, this old Kaviyachal, he can't provide the rain, he can't bring the rains down because he's powerless. as a result of the Bittul Torah. Ein mach ela oni. How do we know that mach means a poor person? Shenemar vayikrochav zayin, with regard to someone who takes a neder of erkiolai to pay the hegdish his value. The mach hu merkecha, and he is too poor to pay that evaluated money of erkin. Im ani hu v'em b'chol l'chalim below erko hareisha mach perusho ani. He's a poor person. V'ein mekara el HaKadosh Baruch. How do we know that mekara refers to Hashem? Shenemar pasuk Tilim hamekara b'mayim ali Yosef. HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates a kind of a roof up in Shamayim. B'mayim haprusim me'aleh. The waters of rain are stretched out on top of the Shamayim, on the sky, and therefore the pasuk means Vatzaltayim. No, it's because Bnei Yisrael are atzlanim, they're lazy, and they're not occupied in the study of Torah. Yimach ha Mekara. The Mekara, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who stretches the rains across the sky, Kaviyachol becomes an ani, as if he doesn't have the power to bring down the rain from his upper chambers, which are the roofs on the sky. Rav Yosef Omer Me'hocha, from whence do we derive that Kishamim are withheld because of the violation of Bittul Torah, Paskin Iyov, V'atol Ro, or Bahir, Hu Bashchakim, V'ruach Ovra Vatit Taharem. Okay, now the Gemara has to explain how we derive this conclusion from the Pasuk. Pasuk literally translates as, and when they do not see light, the skies are patchy, but a wind blows and clears them. So we start with the word or, and they do not see light. Ein or elitar shenemar ki ner mitzvah v'torah or, pasuk of Mishnah. But here, hu bashchakim, the skies are patchy. So the Gemara says, in order to interpret that phrase, Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel will look at the Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel afilu b'shosha rakia nase behorin. Patches of clouds. Minumar means like a leopard. You know, your spots. It's very spotty, and it's full of clouds. Lahorid talumot. It looks like the rains are going to come down, but nevertheless, ruach ovra vatitarem. The wind comes and clears up the sky from all these clouds and disperses the clouds. So the pasuk means that because Klal Yisrael did not see the light of Torah, in the beginning of the pasuk says they do not see the light. That means they don't dedicate themselves to the study of Torah. Therefore, Netzarim HaGeshomim, the rains will be withheld. Amar Rabbi Ami ein hagsham netzarim ela bavon gezel, because of the sin of theft. Shenemar in Iyov it says al kapayim kisa or, which literally translates with clouds he conceals rain, and he darshins bavon kapayim. Whenever it refers to the kapayim, which are the hands of a person, it's an allusion, it's a symbol for the avon of gezel, of stealing. Kisa or, which means that the rains will be withheld. The ein kapayim elach chomos. How do we know the kapayim, the palms, refer to stealing? Shenemar pasuk Yona Hechamos asher umina chamos asher b'kapeim, from the theft in their hands. V'ein or elamota. And when the pasuk says kisa or, it means that the rains will be withheld. Shenemar in Eov. Again, this is a pasuk that the Gemara is interpreting when the Malach, whose name is Af Bari, we sing about it on Shmini Atzeres in the Tfilas Gishamim before Musa.
Right.
Af Bari, that's the name of a Malach. Yatriach Av Yafitz Anan Oro. He scatters the rains and the ore of the clouds because of the sin of theft. Aresha or mishamish kikinu lemota. Umashmos apasuk shavona gezel mechase umoneas yiridas hagishomi. It's got a long footnote here. It says each one of the Amoraim that interpret the sin, identify the sin, each one uses the terminology Ein Gitzamim Netzarim Ela Be'avon, which seems to indicate that only this particular sin was singled out by the Amora as the cause for the withholding of rain. In other words, other sins are not the cause for the withholding of rains. And that means that all these Amoraim are arguing about what is the cause of Atziras Geshamim. However, he says the following. Af hagemora no ketes kol memru b'fnei atzma v'lo b'derech havas machlokes. The Gvuras Ari, the Shagsai, says the Gemara doesn't seem to quote these various statements as a machlokes. Mishum shekol echad ma'amoraim alo lo shamas divrei chavero, because no one heard or responded to the words of another Amora. So that according to the Gvuras Ari, each Amora is excluding other causes. However, the Sfas Emes disagrees. Ein Geshamim Netzarim Ela doesn't mean that only this particular sin is the cause, the only singular sin, the cause for Atziras Geshamim. Like, for example, the Gemara says, Ein Mayim Ela Torah. Doesn't mean that you can't interpret Mayim in its simple Pshuto Shel Mikra, but rather when it says Ein X Ella Y, Kavanos Lahoros Ki Af Sheish Sibos Rabos. There may be many different causes for Atziras Geshamim. Mikomakom B'koach Siba Zu Bilvad, the power inheres in this one particular sin, Ligrom Latziras Geshamim, even if there would be no other sins. The Gemara asks, "My takante, how can we bring about a termination of Atziras Geshamim? Yarbe b'sfila. We need to add and intensify our supplications. Shenemar, in that very pasuk in Eov, that speaks about Atziras Geshamim, because in Gezel it says, "Vayitzav olel b'mafgia," and the word mafgia, which means paga, is always an indication of tefillah. Ein piel tefillah shenemar, pasuk in Yirmiyah, ve'ata al tispalel biyad ha'om hazeh, ve'al tifka bi. And God says to Yirmiyah, don't even pray on their behalf. And that's the case of Anshe Yehuda, that were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Yom Rabbi Ami, my dichsiv, what does the pasuk mean in Koheles? Im keha habarzel vehulo panim kilkel. if the iron is dull and one does not wet its edge. So the word kea is a reference to a sharp knife that now became dulled. And the end of the pasuk says, Chayolim yigaber, the Yisron Haksher Chachma. So Rabbi Ami interprets this pasuk that just like you have a knife made of metal and it gets dulled, so too the skies become weak and they're not sharp. And they stop milahorid tal umatar, I think should be the next word. Yeah. Umatar Vishvil Maisa Hadar Shehem Mikul Kolin. So because of the violations of the degenerate generation, the rains will not fall down. The sky is no longer sharp. It's dull. Shenemar Rahulo Panim Kilkel. And one does not wet its edge. My takanosam, how can they bring the rains down? Yiskabru be rachamim. They should ask for divine compassion. Shenemar, it says in the other part of the pasuk, v'chayolim yegaber, which means yesh lahagbir tzvos shel anoshim sheyamdu b'tfilo. So remember, we said that the end of the pasuk mentions chayalim. What are these chayalim? Who are these soldiers, so to speak? Those are the soldiers that pray. Sha'omdim b'tfilo. And the Maharsha adds, Shetfila shel rabim kocha rab. There's a tremendous power to the tefillah of Rabbim. Now we're up to Reish Lakish. Let me just play with this for a second.